Welcome again to TNS Radio Ireland. I am Mike Montagne, original 1968 author of Mathematically Perfected Economy, speaking on Mathematically Perfected Economy and Absolute Consensual Representation. A fact of our own sovereignty, of capable self-determination, and of a resultant universal public affirmation of justice requires that each of us can either affirm or conclusively invalidate the proposition of mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation as vital singularities. Mathematically perfected economy is our right to unexploited representation of entitlement. And it is the only way to sustain this right, which is indispensable not only to justice, but to sustained prosperity in our industrial commercial endeavors. Absolute consensual representation is the only way we will ever establish a mathematically perfected economy within the present climate of global political betrayal. The theses of mathematically perfected economy not only prove and solve the fundamental causes of the present global monetary failure. 30 years ago, they even accurately calculated when this failure would transpire. Today, we have literally millions of 11th hour imposters not only pretending to author forms of our vital theses which are not even true, but pretending to deduce solution without even the fundamental pretext of actual cause. Because every mathematic riddle has a singular answer, because all the falsification in the world is only adverse to capable self-determination, and because original material, analyses, and solution are intellectual property, this broadcast is subject to copyright and trademark claims. All rights and descending claims of authority, therefore, are reserved. John Kennedy raised the fact that it's because the most of our problems are man-made that we can solve them. Of course, then, if our problems are man-made, the resolution of our problems will inevitably hinge upon introspection. That is, if we were on the side of wrong, if we contributed to the division, if we dismissed fact, hoping to prevail by what can never serve us, if we divorce ourselves from the only analysis which identifies the problem, that we can understand its solution, then we ourselves have denied ourselves, the only course that saves us. I'd like this week to return to an issue that was raised in the suicide letter that I read. Because even though we've been through these explanations countless times now already, for some reason we're disinclined to apply them to our situations as would save us. In other words, I know here at TNS we advocate the official offer. What if your official offer were coupled with irrefutable arguments which sustained a proposition that your offer needed to be accepted not because of some ostensible alley for circumventing the intent of the law, but that these arguments for an offer which you might make as, say, perhaps one half of what your mortgage is that you can no longer pay because a so-called economy which has been imposed upon you has put you out of work and destroyed your family. Everything that you intended even to do in life. Suppose these arguments instead amount to irrefutable mathematic arguments that your payment should be approximately 1/10 or 1/12 what it is. And suppose that what I mean by irrefutable arguments is that no court could defeat those arguments, because in any attempt to do so, the court would have to establish that in the creation of money, the banking system gave up commensurable consideration to debts which it otherwise falsifies to itself. In other words, these irrefutable arguments bring the cycle of consideration right back to the fact that though there is a debt, it is not to the banking system, and therefore, since the banking system has no risk, neither is interest justified, and therefore, since money then is inherently only a representation of our entitlement, which needs to be immutable, thus our obligatory schedule of payment applies, which indeed reduces your mortgage to 1/10 or 1/12. Suppose instead of replying with an official offer, you expanded, and I suggest you do this in your own words, because it's the evaluation, critical thinking, and need to be able to defend yourself, not just in court, but to each other in public until we master this issue of money. And so if you do this in your own words, and you have to put to pen what we've repeated hundreds and hundreds of times in short of 100 programs, as your irrefutable arguments. And you have this amendment for mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation, which I know very few of you have signed. And I know also that some who have signed it certainly aren't defending it against every 11th hour pretender who rises up to make this claim or that claim, and which a week and a half ago, without even an explanation how or why, mathematically perfected economy was defeated. Instead, this one people's public trust has to be raised first, and I still haven't heard a single reason why or how that could possibly be, even as I get hundreds and hundreds of texts and emails every day on the topic. Not one reason why. The issue I want to resolve, to outline where I'm headed with this, is, as I read the suicide letter, if you recall, this gentleman who was about to turn 40 indicated that the government had cut his purported compensation for a condition that we understand from this obfuscation of our currency, a condition which was artificially imposed upon him, which inevitably dispossessed him not only of everything he had earned and paid for many times over, but he'd been dispossessed even of the opportunity to work. I get during every day a tremendous amount of communication from all parts of the world. I take that back, not all parts of the world. There are certain places you never hear from. Although my work has been reproduced and praised in the former Soviet Union, for example, since the mid-1990s, I rarely hear from any citizens there. Likewise, I never hear from China, although on the heels of the Beijing Olympics, I blogged the fate of the ostensible debt that China purportedly holds. That is, United States public debt to China, if any, which it's a curious thing that everywhere you go in the world, you don't find that the citizens can give you an accountable explanation how it could be that their country, their government, has assumed debts to foreign countries, comprised in fact of only paper or digital representations thereof. So if we think that this is not a serious issue, when in fact, when that's what we raise, we're only raising federal debt. And public debt, or private debt rather, has already escalated beyond terminal failure, such that under this obfuscation, federal governments could never avoid the ire of their own people if in fact they were not pouring money into circulation. Now we pretend to rise up and to recognize that our governments are against us, that they're plotting against us, and they're seeking to control us. But within politics itself, there's a very well-known and recognized limitation to these conspiracy theories which we spend far too much time on. And that fact is that federal governments are so prone to leakage, and these purported conspiracies require so much coordination and impervious procedures to public scrutiny, that is, that it's implausible that federal governments across the world pull these conspiracies off without leakage, which would inevitably trace, and rapidly so, to every connected perpetrator, of which there would have to be many. But the thing that's important whenever there's a conspiracy is to understand not that there is a disservice or a crime against the people, because if that's all we have, then we don't have the way to solve these issues ourselves. So it's even a worse thing if we have solution and instead we make it a regular interest to disregard the only identification of our problems and its only solution, to instead mindlessly repeat the dogma of one conspiracy theory after another, raised to a fever pitch by little more than superstition and our own unworthy lies. Yesterday, for example, I was sent a link to a YouTube video which has approximately an hour-long presentation by Michael Rivero, where he's going through the history that my pages presented to the modern internet since 30 years before. And you know, my jaw is just dropping during all of it because I wrote Michael years ago, and it was then that evidently he looked up my work and repeated it, as Bill Still did in his Money Masters video produced by Austrian economists who in fact advocate banking. And Bill Still, of course, without any mathematic qualification of the proposition, pledges to you that 100% reserves will solve our problem, and you don't even really know what he means by that. We can presume, of course, that he means 100% gold reserves. And our gold advocates will shake their fist and say, yay. But the last thing that they want, in truth, is a return to the constitutional value of gold. People have asked me for many, many, many years, since the beginning really, what are the ramifications of mathematically perfected economy? Insofar as gold is concerned, for example. And I explained from the beginning there's been one consistent answer, and that is that what we trade in an economy is our contribution to the overall pool of wealth. If we raise the walls, the framing of a house, our compensation for that needs to be the value of our work. We don't claim in raising the wall that the value of the nails and of the studs which were produced by others or our work. We claim a wage for our contribution to the overall pool of wealth, which is the work that we did. The persons who created the studs want likewise. And any of us who violate this principle by insisting on compensation which is beyond what is realistic for our contribution to the pool of wealth. In other words, if we're tied to the purse strings of banking and we purchase the supply of milk, we incorporate it of vital infrastructure to position ourselves to exploit without, in fact, making any real contribution ourselves, to reduce the rewards to the farmers who produce milk to below their costs, so that we, tied to the purse strings of banking, can purchase all the milk production farms and further incorporate them in our system of exploitation, so that over 1 or 2 or 3 decades or whatever, we might increase the price of milk, whatever, 5-fold, 10-fold, 20-fold, 50-fold. Do you remember when a quart of fresh milk delivered to your home cost a few cents? And how much have wages gone up since then? So, I'm sorry, but we all understand that we really can only benefit, and we only have an economy if we're rewarded for our contribution, and if anyone receives more than their contribution, that is an offense against us. And so, what are the ramifications of mathematically perfected economy on the price of gold? You will find, since gold people in fact insisted that I write articles on mathematically perfected economy for Kitco, for example, way back in the early 90s, that although mathematically perfected economy preserves the rightful value of gold and is the only way to protect the rightful value of gold from exploitation or exploiters, you found, though I was asked to write articles for those forums, that who rose up against this but those who owned gold, hoping that the price of gold would rise and that they would make out more for what gold they hold, not even thinking what the costs of their terminal sums of debt would impose upon them to the negative of what they hoped to make out by artificial escalation of the price of gold. Well, in fact, the probable fact is that the price of gold will rise further under mathematically perfected economy. But why is that? We have a program over here in the States. It's called Gold Rush. Now, there have been a number of permutations of this program already. There's been gold mining in South America that's been covered, besides Alaska, which is what Gold Rush, the series, focuses on. And there's been mining in Ghana, Africa, as well. Now, if you were to study these issues and just take in a mindful account of what you're viewing, instead of watching purely for entertainment value, the entertainment actually becomes far more gripping when you really truly take in what's going on here. I'm a citizen of the state of Oregon, and we have a group of people from Oregon who went to Alaska. They were dispossessed of their first mine. They didn't make expenses their first season. 38 ounces of gold, something like that, is what they produced in their first season, amongst 6 or 8 men. Not enough to get by. What motivated them, knowing nothing about gold mining, to master all they could and to leave their families behind to try and make a living? Every one of them was faced with foreclosure, bankruptcy, lack of work. They were desperate. So they went and they spent money to make money. They worked. And the price of gold was not even enough to make their expenses. They went in the hole. They found an investor, and that's an important thing to recall as we tell this story. They found an investor and leased some claims up in the Klondike region of Alaska. And they needed to produce something now, given the earth-moving equipment that they were utilizing. And as I follow along, it's not absolutely certain, but I'm afraid, it costs her something like $1,000 a day for fuel for each of these giant earth-moving trucks. Not to mention the wear and tear that they're not paying for. They don't even have spare tires. A slash tire put in a season puts a truck out of commission. The capacities of which are critical to the success of their endeavors. And now they have a dozen men working on this, and they just concluded coverage of their season. In fact, just last night, and I recorded this because in truth it documents the situation. And we can say that over the course of 3 years that they've in truth matured very credibly in their efforts. Yes, they've made mistakes, and yes, they could have done better. But the truth of the matter is, when we add up all the facts at hand, none of us going into a new venture where any unknowns are involved have all the answers. We have to probe for them. We have to develop them. We do the best job that we can. And so mistakes are human, indeed. They are. Although where we're anticipating and hoping for success, our mistakes then compel us never, never, never to cross that ground again. That is, to recognize explicitly what our mistake was and how it jeopardized our efforts, and to resolve that into some principle where we guarantee to ourselves the most success that's plausible. Life is short, we find, in the end, and time wasted is a travesty. So these people have basically struck the mother lode, is the expression. They had an 800-ounce season. They set a goal for 1,000 ounces. But it was something like 600 ounces that they needed just to break even over their costs. And what share the investor gets of what's beyond breaking even, I don't know, but I do assume that there is a share, because when you invest in something, it's for a share of the takings. You're hoping to make profit beyond your costs, which requires a share of the takings without any contribution of work. So the first difference that mathematically perfected economy would make is that investment, that is all the equipment and backing to prepare for this effort, would be absorbed by the miners themselves at a far lesser cost. And a further fact precipitates that the miners would get their full shares out of whatever they succeeded in turning up, which would substantially benefit these people just of their own. It would also make it possible for more people to engage in whatever their endeavors, not just gold mining, but whatever these people had originally intended to do here in the States. But in the end, there is a critical observation which is never raised in these shows, but it's right there, staring us in the face at every moment. And that is that all of these different mining endeavors, while they're praised as great successes, Parker Schnabel, for instance, very remarkable young man, maturity far beyond his years, running a mining operation, managing a crew, improving their washing techniques, aggressively consuming in a single season far more terrain, processing far more dirt and rock than perhaps in that whole mine's history, having by far the greatest weeks, for example, on record. At the end of the season, his mother, who does his accounting, had to have a meeting with him because he had, after all that success, he was $40,000 in debt. And in the last days of the season, to resolve that, as temperatures plummeted to well below freezing, and a foot plus of snow fell overnight on all their equipment and froze their sluice boxes. They mined to the last minute for a few more days, and he was able to succeed in a 31-ounce cleanup, which to process he had to take home and hand pan it. And he produced 31 ounces. I think it was 1 or 2 ounces over the goal he'd set for the season, for which he just broke even. When they asked him about this in the last show, he says, well, yeah, I work cheap. Under mathematically perfected economy, the costs of producing are minimized because we're not forced to share our profits with those who don't contribute to the production. We can take the risk ourselves. You could do it with an investor still. It's not against the principles of mathematically perfected economy, but you do so at a competitive disadvantage, as you do in real life, because you have to produce substantially beyond what pays for your equipment just to pay an investor. You break even last. So what would happen to the price of gold under mathematically perfected economy? What do I deduce from these conditions? Now, mathematically perfected economy is the only truly free market. So it leaves the price of gold to be determined by those who intend to procure it for whatever reasons, and those who produce it. But the whole idea of free enterprise is just reward for our production. And yes, if you go into gold mining as a neophyte and succeed in finding gold, but not to anywhere near the degree that we would expect of a competent miner, of course, your wages should be a minimum then, as they would be if a team of miners produced 38 ounces of gold in a season. But here we are, pretty much the same team, few new members. Instead of, I think it was approximately 8 men, it's a dozen now. Now they're producing 800 ounces in a season. And let's just say that 200 ounces beyond breaking even, or approximately $300,000 worth of gold then, is to be split among a dozen men. Well, what you find is that for all that, they haven't even really truly acquired a reasonable wage. Parker, having the best season that mine ever had by far, broke even, no wages. And the other mine, the Porcupine Creek mine, likewise, very little profit, share between 3 people and investors. So the math of this is the real story. It's all math. What dirt you process, whether you process the best dirt, how much yield you get for whatever quality of dirt you're processing, it all predicates whether or not you succeed or not, and it's all math. We all do math in our work, whether you're a musician or a poet or a drug dealer. We do our math. And the math has to come out, or we fail. What we do know then is that this highly successful, productive effort deserves its just reward. And because the price of fuel and the claims itself and so on and so forth has driven costs up to where they are, that the rightful price of gold given those costs would be higher than it is now, because the only thing that justifies all that work is due reward for our effort. But why is Vin not building houses now, and why have all of us been dispossessed of our opportunity to persist in the endeavors that we engaged in? And why are costs so high in gold mining? The price of everything has been driven up by the obfuscation of our currency. That is, as we maintain a vital circulation by perpetually borrowing principal and interest back into circulation, yes, being as private debt has exceeded our creditworthiness, we're not borrowing this back so much as federal government is, purportedly on our behalf. But federal governments around the world are only pouring money into circulation so that we have a minimal vital circulation, which isn't even sufficient to arrest foreclosure, bankruptcy, to sustain our jobs, to sustain our ability to produce and to trade with each other. And being as this artificial escalation of falsified debt to banking then imposes ever greater costs of servicing and escalating sum of debt upon us, until not only can we no longer afford to service the additional escalation, but we can't even afford, under the costs which are already imposed upon us, to sustain our production, our earning, and our livelihoods or prosperity. This is the inevitable consequence of this obfuscation of our currency. What I'm getting at then is that the costs of producing this gold likewise would dramatically decrease under mathematically perfected economy, because all that they're influenced by the escalation of falsified debt is eradicated, and because it's our further recognized responsibility that we have to eradicate exploitation. You see every year in this country, for example, that as spring and summer approach, the threat of rising fuel prices. And so we're pleasantly pleased when they go down and we don't say anything. But the reason they go down is they're raised the maximum amount that we can be exploited. Imagine if we recognized our need to eradicate exploitation. Now, that isn't to stupidly mutter that money is created out of thin air, or money is the root of all evil, or money is a deception, it doesn't even exist. You heard Max Igan. Money's a deception, it doesn't even exist. And this proposition of one people's public trust, what does it do? It offers you money and suddenly claims it to be legal. And here TNS is advocating that that has to happen first. What about absolute consensual representation? It was rude to ask. I want to thank many people who wrote off to the side, even during the program last week, enthusiastically encouraging me to tell it like it is. You know, we can shy away from our controversies between each other, or we can be adults and we can own up to the facts. If I've spent 2 years just pitching mathematically perfected economy in your mind, you know and I know that I've wasted your time and my time. And the truth of the matter is, if that message really resonated with you, you'd be speaking these facts yourself. You don't need me to resolve this for you. What would the price of gold be? Given the costs, it would increase because we could afford to pay more for it. Gold would go up. But suppose you own 100 ounces of gold. There's few people who do, but just suppose you do. And suppose that means that the price of gold goes up another, well, even $500 an ounce, which people would, I'm just saying that hypothetically, which means I don't need to defend it. I'm stating it not as a realistic goal or benchmark for the price of gold, but just say, what if it did? And a person holds 100 ounces of gold, and we multiply, 100 ounces times $500 that they're hoping to acquire just for holding it. What is right about that? And are they even profiting when they stood up since the first days that I wrote articles for Kitco at their request? And they stood up against mathematically perfected economy, hoping to make out like bandits for holding gold. 100 ounces times $500, probably far more than gold should go up further under a truly stable economy, and particularly under an economy which allows and provides for us to prosper according to the fruit of our doings. $500 an ounce times 100 ounces. What do you make out? $50,000? And you're living in a $35,000 home built in 1963, which is now $1 million home that you're paying $2 or $3 million altogether for. What was the profit of raising Austrian economics dogma against mathematically perfected economy so that you could make $50,000 of unearned profit yourself? At the cost of $2 million in interest just on your home. For a debt, a falsified debt, the principal of which had been multiplied from $35,000 to $1 million, all so that banks could defraud us of all that. How much more, and how much more preposterously, could you cut your nose off to spite your face? And so we have this controversy, and we have controversy after controversy after controversy. And an issue that's been raised amidst supporters is that we're not accomplishing anything for, in truth, what's a horrendous amount of effort in this venue. I don't have any problem when TNS hosts interview contradicting propositions, as long as those propositions are evaluated without omission by the critical thinking which would size them up for what they are. After all, what is objective reporting, for example, which is something we should not only desire but demand of our news. And if we do worse, that is to wander here and there away from solution, never to master the principles which serve us, where are we going? Of course, I've asked that question many times, and in truth, I don't see anyone who's not come to this venue because I'm here. I don't see anyone really motivated to rise to the occasion that these issues predicates. You know, there's an alternate possibility in the story Braveheart. William rides into the village to avenge the murder of his wife, and instead someone rushes from the market to stop him, saying, "William, you don't know what you're doing, you're wrong," or "Listen to this man here who wants to take your horse." he has a solution. We don't even know what the solution is, and we're saying it's a solution. A multitude of solutions exists. And that's a wonderful thing. So, I wonder every moment that all of these efforts have ground to a screeching halt here. Well, people are suicidal. I wonder if you really want to know. Do we care? Oh, we say we do. And we say that something else is solution and has to go first, negating my every effort at the snap of your fingers. You who know the beautiful thing that a multitude of solutions exist. You know, when I speak about these things with people who don't spend the time on the internet that we would listening to this beautiful proposition of a multitude of solutions, which none of which are qualified to any degree whatsoever, people wonder how I could be focused at all on an audience over which that preposterous proposition could fly. And here I'm rude because I raise that fact. So it isn't with great regret that I'm constantly reevaluating why it is that I try and wake a small sector of people who insist that the nemesis of mathematically perfected economy, raised at the 11th hour, has to take its stead. We all have to think about how we spend our time if we're to succeed at whatever we do. This man who wrote this suicide note that we at TNS hoped to save, he mentioned, and I didn't want to take off on a separate tack at the time because I realize people have a impossible time smoking marijuana and following all this that they already know so much that they don't have to listen to it. But he wrote in his letter that he had just been priced out of rent for ever shabbier quarters and his rent was C25, as how it was expressed in the letter. Now, I could be wrong, but I presume that means £2,500 a month rent. £2,500 a month. Generally, things are more expensive in Europe than they are here. Although, if you wanted an apartment in San Francisco, drywall, cheap studs, you can hear the family quarrels on both sides of you and above and below. $2,500 a month. Same thing. How many times have we explained how and why a $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan would cost you $1,000 a year, or $83.33 a month under mathematically perfected economy? And how many of you, as I read the words he'd written, C25, connected the dots that if we were united in effect a singular resolution of our monetary affairs, that we could support this man on the dole even for 1/25 or less of present costs immediately. And what hope have we provided by sitting on our hands? None. Both questions are rhetorical. Instead of sitting at home, unable to heat his premises, crying in a chair for his loneliness and despair, he'd still be employed. He'd be far more employable. He'd be employable to the maximal extent of all the virtues he'd acquired by education and discipline, development of his self. His money would go 10 or 12 times farther, because that's the disparity. And every one of us who's sitting on our hands or advocating that there's an alternate solution is actually the problem. It's because of the quality of the audience at TNS also. Here I am violating the Dale Carnegie school of butter up your audience and pitch them some BS that makes them happy. It's because of all the controversy that's raised that we don't get anywhere, and it's because of this that we all know I'm going to have to leave. I've come back a couple of times already. No, I'm not just playing some game here. Fact is, if I'm flushing my time down the toilet, I have to reevaluate that. What happens is, every week it's controversial for you, it's uncomfortable, it's not even interesting to understand our problems and their only solution, and it's far more interesting for some man to just come in and tell us that something else is the solution without even showing us how that could possibly be. And we don't even bother to notice all of the disparities you heard last week in the portion of that same man's presentation that I played, where he's taken my work and crediting it. He's crediting it to a blatant plagiarist who took the very things that I explained in the very interview this man conducted with me, and he's incorporated them in a book as if it was his thinking. And guess who was out of the picture? Guess who attempted to usurp this initiative from the very moments they were introduced to it? And while he says money doesn't exist, it's a deception, what is he offering in this One People's Public Trust? He's offering you money. He says they've already accomplished these things, which they haven't accomplished at all. And I meant today to go over this thing in detail, but I realize that the facts aren't even important to you, not to this audience. Now, other audiences that I have, those facts aren't important either. But why? Because from the moments they first hear a qualification of a fact of singular solution, they're on it. The lights went on. They recognize its truth. And they never turn back. When we're not faithful to the truth, all we can do is encounter the ramifications of our own blunders. We could have saved that man. He could be a happy, working, productive, and prosperous person again. But without mathematically perfected economy, without our recognition and practice of the only principles which sustain immutable representation of entitlement, we're not even dealing with the issue at hand. Now, if you think these 11th hour One People's Public Trust pretenders are the solution, then I say go your way. And because that's the thrust of what's been raised against me here, I think it's time for me to move on permanently. I have things I've fallen behind on every week. There's all these arguments I'm hearing about Bada Bing this and Roger Hayes that and Michael Tellinger this and Max Igan that. And excuse me. I'm rude. I get sent things from people who are, I don't think they're just fine people because they side with me or because they encourage me to find a more serious venue, but because they dig up things which we would all be digging up if we indeed were the critical thinkers who are going to master our issues instead of crying the government's making us fools by putting fluoride in our water. I drink the same water that you do. Yeah, our water is fluoridated. By government proxy. But we have to find a way to succeed. And if you're not part of this, then unless I'm wrong, there's no way that we're resolving our issues here. Somebody wrote me just the other day, people may hate you for being different and not living by society's standards, but deep down they wish they had the courage to do the same. The same man wrote, I'm no fan of Churchill, but here's an interesting quote of his for all those gold standard parrots out there. Of course, he, Churchill that is, missed solution and rectitude by a mile. But at least what he says gives the gold bugs something to think about. This is a quote of Winston Churchill. When I was moved by many arguments and forces in 1925, 12 years after the Federal Reserve Act was passed, to return to the gold standard, already gone, I was assured by the highest experts, that is, practitioners of the deception and pseudoscience we call economics. I was assured by the highest experts, and our experts are men of great ability. What ability he doesn't say, and of indisputable integrity and sincerity. Excuse me, Freudian slip. That we were anchoring ourselves to reality and stability by readopting the gold standard. And I accepted their advice. I take for myself and my colleagues of other days, whatever degree of blame and burden for having accepted their advice. But what happened? We have had no reality, no stability. 5 years, 4 years before the first Great Depression precipitates 15 years after the Federal Reserve Act promises to solve the problems it can only cause. We have had no reality, no stability. Winston Churchill. He goes on, the price of gold has risen since then by more than 70%. That is as if a 12-inch foot rule had been stretched to 19 or 20 inches. As if the pound, avoirdupois, had suddenly become 23 or 24 ounces instead of 16. Of course, a troy ounce is 14, I think, to the pound, but whatever. Look at what this has meant to everybody who has been compelled to execute their contracts upon this irrationally enhanced scale. In other words, he's making an observation here which intimates that indeed money needs to be an immutable representation of entitlement, or injury is inflicted. Do we have to solve this? Does one people's public trust solve the volumetric and dispositional improprieties of money that we have now? No. It pretends it's giving each of you $5 billion, which $5 billion doesn't even exist, nor do they have it. He says, look at what this has meant to everybody who has been compelled to execute their contracts upon this irrationally enhanced scale. Irrational. To do anything that persists in this, here we are, almost 100 years later, he's saying then is irrational. And when have we heeded those words? Since we had solution, even. Look at the gross unfairness of such distortion to all producers of new wealth. What are the very terms that I've been expressing? Resolve. I've never crossed these words before. They were sent to me just days ago. But here, Winston Churchill is concurring in what? That one people's public trust would save us, or mathematically perfected economy? Look at the gross unfairness of such distortion to all producers of new wealth, and to all that labor and science and enterprise can give us. I emphasize the word can because 4 years later we have the world's first Great Depression, which is the inevitable consequence of a process which can only multiply falsified debt into terminal sums of falsified debt. Can give us if never subject to terminal exploitation. Look at the enormously increased volume of commodities which have to be created in order to pay off the same mortgage debt or loan. There's your £2,500 a month rent. that now the dole can't even afford to give you. Look at the enormously increased volume of commodities which have to be created in order to pay off the same mortgage, debt, or loan. Should we not look at the math? How much? Look at it, he says. Well, excuse me. Look at it? Show it to us if you really want to communicate. Go over it. What is its measure? If you pay $100,000 for a $35,000 home built in 1963, you've paid $65,000. But that's just then. If that cost of that house has been artificially escalated to an asking price in 2010 of $1 million, is that just the additional cost? Where's all the interest on that $1 million as well? If that house sold in 1985 for $500,000, is that $500,000 of additional principal in addition to the $35,000 which paid for the house? You bet it is. And so is all the interest on that. And how many times has that house been sold since it was built in 1963? For how many prices? And how much interest was paid on each of those prices in the meanwhile? And understand that when you pay against one of these falsified debts to a banking system, 99.9% of your first payment goes entirely toward interest. Near zero goes toward the principal. He says, look at the enormously increased volume of commodities which have to be created in order to pay off the same mortgage, debt, or loan. Have we ever looked at that? Does it matter to us? But without that math, what have we found? If we don't see how the price is artificially escalated, if we don't see how many times we pay over and over and over for that house, all through these many further different ownerships, we haven't even begun to unravel the amount that he's asked us to look for, much less the cause of it. But if we never get to the cause, which the amount compels us to look for, we have no way to solve our problems. And is the answer to give you each $5 billion now? When we ourselves just said that money doesn't even exist, it's a deception. Now we're giving it to you, an amount that doesn't even exist, and one people's public trust has to happen. It's all over the internet now. It's promoted by the same pathological liars, David Wilcock, Drake, and Benjamin Fulford, who's repeatedly claimed from the vicinity of Japan that more gold than ever existed has recently been discovered to be in the possession of all these banks. Without the math, you can't even find, the truth amidst all the lies. But it was said here that these things have to transpire first. One people's public trust has to happen. And I would say, mark my words, it will never happen except for one doubt what grave doubt I have about humanity, which was raised a few days before last week's program, and that is that you would be inclined to try such a thing. You'll sign up for that instead, hoping for your 5 billion. Because the principles, the few principles of immutable representation of entitlement are too much for you. Look at what this has meant to everybody who has been compelled to execute their contracts upon this irrationally enhanced scale. Look at the gross unfairness of such distortion to all producers of new wealth, and to all that labor and science and enterprise can give us. Look at the enormously increased volume of commodities which have to be created in order to pay off the same mortgage debt or loan. Minor fluctuation might well be ignored, but I say quite seriously that this is monetary convulsion. I mean, Jesus, Winston. Convulsion. You know, this isn't just waxing poetic. Spend a few minutes and nail what observation you're trying to convey. And, you know, before you know it, you're on the heels of discovering mathematically perfected economy yourself. You're on the heels of discovering that the only principles that can serve you are these few simple facts which persist in a one-to-one-to-one relationship between circulation, what it's to represent, and what it has to be redeemed in. And the fact that we have to pay that to redeem it in it. Only when those four things are cemented together in the fashion that they are in mathematically perfected economy do we sustain the immutable value of money. And he's using the word convulsion. You understand that better than the word obfuscation? No, you don't, because we're not talking about a convulsion. Minor fluctuation might well be ignored, but I say quite seriously that this monetary convulsion has now reached a pitch. A pitch. Does that evoke the idea of irreversible artificial escalation of falsified debt? A pitch where I am persuaded, by what? That the producers of new wealth will not tolerate indefinitely so hideous an oppression. Well, you can't afford to produce new wealth now. And you want to talk about UFOs and one people's public trust. So we have a bit of a communication problem here. He says in his conclusion, I therefore point to this evil and to the search for the methods of remedying it as the first, second, and third of all the problems which should command and rivet our thoughts. I therefore point to this evil and to the search for the methods of remedying it as the first, second, and third of all the problems which should command and rivet our thoughts. And I was lectured by the same person who immediately advocated that one people's trust should prevail over mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation. I was lectured that everyone understands, everyone has a problem, everyone has a solution, that are all of equal importance. Yet, from the beginning, the reason that I have sought to give you the revelation of mathematically perfected economy, just one of the reasons I've done that is because the fact is that to prevail in every country of the world, to prevail in imposing what are simply called central banking systems upon us, requires such a profound and complete subversion of representation that to challenge this system of exploitation, our challenges can never meet the light of day. Banking has to own our media. I said this in the beginning, and many people repeat that now. But that doesn't make the solution any different. There is still one and one only solution for circulatory inflation. There is still one and one only solution for maldisposition or inherent, irreversible multiplication of falsified debt by purported interest, which interest is imposed upon us by mere publisher of further representation of our promissory obligations to each other, which publisher merely pretends that their rightful entitlement or property is at stake, when they never gave up commensurable consideration in the whole life cycle of a single unit of all our currency, in the whole history of this lie that we're calling banking, in the terminal lie of banking, the ancient ruse of the money changers, which I unraveled for Max Igan, and he betrayed me immediately, not only by promoting his friend Thomas Anderson as the author of my words, of my intellectual property, which I desire only to preserve, that I can focus you on solution. Which solution here was recently so negated here at TNS as to insist, without any qualification or diligence whatsoever, that the few minutes of further betrayal by Max Igan prevail over mathematically perfected economy, which has withstood all criticisms and attacks for 45 years, because it is so blatantly obvious and simple that if, for example, circulatory inflation and deflation are defined as either increases or decreases in circulation per represented property, there is one and one only solution for circulatory inflation and deflation, which of course is indispensable to maintaining the value of money, because if it isn't redeemable in an equal volume of property as it represents, then you've breached the whole principle of immutable representation, which we all depend upon if money is to service rather than serve exploitation to take from us, which is very important, because if the means of exploitation inherently and irreversibly increase as ever greater sums of periodic interest on an ever greater sum of falsified debt, then the result of those means is inevitably terminal. It precipitates in all of the conditions everywhere around us. I therefore point to this evil and to the search for the methods of remedying it as the first, second, and third of all the problems which should command and rivet our thoughts. Winston Churchill. A supporter dug that up, Gavin Davidson, just a few days ago. Never heard it before. Meanwhile, Michael Rivero is taking my parable of perfect economy, and now that it's becoming well known that the words were my words issued through the fictional mouth of Benjamin Franklin, rather than giving the story any credit or attention, what's he doing? They have changed my words into the most preposterous lie you can imagine, where Benjamin Franklin, ostensibly instead, the fictional Benjamin Franklin that I presented, is instead arguing for, quote, honest money, unquote. And of course, there's no citation for the source either. So all that he can, so that he can pretend to be an authority, Michael Rivero is giving you the same information. 100,000 people visit this 1-hour radio spiel. Nobody researches where he got this quote of Franklin. Nobody connects the dots. And what's it accomplished? We blew right by mathematically perfected economy, which was the source of this information, so that we could what? So that we could nothing. Because that's what's happening. Nothing. In regard to our controversy, then, I think it's unavoidable that we look back on any moment in history where man instead rose to the occasion. Now I'm perfectly content myself to leave TNS to advocates of one people's public trust. And likewise, I'm perfectly happy to leave TNS to the further advocates of Roger Hayes and Michael Tellinger. And I do remark to myself, I do note that it's of no good to fail to question what each of us do. That is, I expect to be questioned with the same exhaustive critical thinking that each and every other proposition should and must be subjected to if we indeed are to find our way. I don't take it as a personal assault then, but I do take personal responsibility for defending the truth with all my God-given responsibilities to do so. I was said to be rude for challenging this one people's public trust on TNS, and I think that instead that worthy people, worthy of representation, that is, worthy people would ask the questions that I raised, which were politely raised. What about ACR? Absolute consensual representation. What about it? Instead of challenging this proposition that one people's public trust has to prevail first, which was not even defined in any way, where such a sequence would even be implied, yet it was insisted rather than questioned. It was insisted that indeed that must be a fact. Just because Max Igan, who says money's a deception, it doesn't even exist, is here advocating the extreme hypocrisy that you be provided money. The same money which the document I read last week simply suddenly proclaims that it's lawful money. He also said they'd already acquired this. This had already been accomplished. So this $5 billion for every person on earth already exists in some people's public trust for you. And can you even touch it? Does that money even exist? That deception, that thing that doesn't exist, does it exist now? When it's never even existed in such quantity as they're pretending to provide it even? Not even a fraction of that? How nonsensical can we be? So it's I don't think that people who would listen to all that hypocrisy and not even find the obvious blatant contradictions in all of it, I don't think that those people deserve representation. I don't think that they want it. I don't think they have an interest in it. I don't think that they've identified a principle of it. A multitude of solutions can exist, and they're all just so beautiful, and all of them are equally important. What did Winston Churchill just say? The first, second, and third things which should rivet our attention. I was assaulted for being rude. What about ACR? Here's how polite the people who've been promoted on TNS without question are. I get reports from all over the world. I've got not one, but several people who even tell me how many bottles of wine certain people consume per evening. Here's what Roger Hayes so often interviewed on TNS without due question. Here's what he has to say about Mike Montagne and mathematically perfected economy, who he refuses to debate. The problem with Mike Montagne is that he does not, all caps, not have reality on his side. My problem is I don't have reality on my side. That's right. The obfuscation of our currency doesn't multiply debt. There isn't a singular solution to inflation and deflation or maldisposition. I don't have reality on my side. The facts don't concur with what I've said to you. The problem with Mike Montagne is that he does not have reality on his side. And anybody with a bit of intelligence can work this out quite quickly if they have the courage to think for themselves. Is that so, Roger Hayes? How would you work that out, that there's an alternate solution to inflation and deflation, or that either don't exist, or that either aren't crimes against us? How would you work out that interest does not multiply falsified debt into terminal sums of falsified debt? How would you work out that the debt does not exist to banking if banking never gave up any commensurable property to debts which it therefore falsifies to itself, Roger Hayes? How would you work that out with a little bit of intelligence quite quickly? He says anybody with a bit of intelligence can work this out quite quickly if they have the courage to think for themselves. Like you ever did, Roger? People are frightened to debate with Mike because he is a very clever man. As if I'm devious, and he's not. Raise your hand. Go ahead. Defend Roger Hayes. He's not devious. This so-called lawful bank, which isn't lawful, which has vacillated in principle, which he's claimed he would appoint 100 men himself, or some committee of people you don't even know who they are, or what principle they're going to follow to decide which 100 men to appoint to some committee which is going to establish this ever vacillating idea of one lawful bank, raised at the 11th hour by a man who you yourselves have heard vastly compromise my original explanation of the obfuscation of the currency, claiming that you can't pay the interest because it doesn't exist. Well, if you can't pay the interest, and you would have to pay the interest with money, then his statement to hold would have to be that the money to pay the interest doesn't exist. Well, how much money has to exist to pay the interest? That's the next question. Anyone who has the courage to think for themselves can find basically that I'm full of crap. How much money would have to exist to pay the interest? Only so much as you could earn back from banking to pay the interest, if it were possible to do it that way. But if banking doesn't absorb so much of our production, as equates to all of our interest, then, as we are forced to maintain a vital circulation because we're compelled to pay more out of it than exists, it isn't that the money doesn't exist to pay the interest, which is our problem, but that we have to borrow it back into circulation as an ever greater sum of debt, which perpetually increases by so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt, until we suffer the present calamity, which is not solved by Roger Hayes' preposterous lawful bank. Now you can invalidate that, can anyone with the courage to think for themselves can invalidate that? Roger Hayes doesn't even do that here. He just claims it can be done. People are frightened to debate with Mike because he is a very clever man. No, that's not true, Roger. It's because I have the truth, and you are a deceiver. It's also because I gave the truth long before you, and all men like you have done, Roger Hayes, is attempt to destroy it by destroying me. So that people who don't do any critical thinking might give you their money, that you may have a way of sustaining yourself by all your lies the rest of your pathetic life. People are frightened to debate with Mike because he's a very clever man, but he is not infallible. For example, he talks about maths and economy in the same sentence as if there was a mathematical link between them. Whoa. Whoa. Do you mean there is no link between math and economy, and anyone with the courage to think for themselves will inevitably discover that fact? Whoa. No comment. He says there isn't a link, as if there was a mathematical link between them. There isn't. And this is the big flaw in Mike's thinking. He is a mathematician, not an economist. What is an economist under this obfuscation of our currency but a proponent of a terminal system of exploitation which only multiplies falsified debt into terminal sums of debt, of falsified debt? And what are we fixing by your lawful bank, Roger Hayes, if that's not a fact? Will making the interest exist as if it doesn't exist already resolve the problem that if money exists to pay the interest, Then to maintain a vital circulation, we have to borrow the principal and interest that we don't earn from the banks back into circulation, even so that we can sustain or service the initial falsified debts of such a system? Of course not. And my problem is I connect the dots of real economy by mathematics, which are faithful to the only principles which can sustain immutable representation of entitlement. The problem is Roger's not even conversant in the issues, and he wants to usurp this as much as one people's public trust. Well, which should go first, second, and third here? TNS host would put mathematically perfected economy last. What am I doing here then? This isn't where the battle will be won if we will fall for crap like this. He says there isn't a mathematical link between them. And this is the big flaw in Mike's thinking. He is a mathematician, not an economist. What economist could be an economist if they weren't a mathematician? Think about it while you're doing the critical thinking, which would invalidate everything I've ever done in my life. In maths, there is no emotion. What's the emotion here, besides laughter? In maths, there is no emotion. It is based on fact. Economies are based on people's perception of value. We buy things based on what we think they are worth. 10 people, 10 possible views of value. Where is he heading with this? When you buy the thing, you agree that you can pay for it. You're deciding between the purchaser and the seller decide on a price. Now that's what we want to do, and I've always said that. But I'm saying the only thing that sustains that is mathematically perfected economy. Because when you spend £10 today for that thing, whatever it is, okay, and you spend £10 tomorrow or 2 months or 2 years or 20 years from now, what is the difference? As this obfuscation of our currency multiplies falsified debt in proportion to a circulation, what's happening is the £10 that you spent in the beginning, a substantial portion of that went to the exploiter, denying it to the producer. So the seller isn't getting immutable representation of entitlement. They're getting a representation of entitlement, ever more of which is dedicated to the exploiter. And 20 years later, owing to the fact that this process multiplies debt at even an inherently escalating rate, ever more of it, if not all of it, is dedicated to the exploiter. From the moment of terminal indebtedness on, all of it's theoretically dedicated to the exploiter, even if it isn't taken, because the process has already imposed terminal failure on the system, and they're attempting to sustain the system by pouring money into circulation, which further debt we're not servicing. And anybody with a little bit of critical thinking can just invalidate all this. And One People's Public Trust and Roger Hayes' purported lawful bank and this Constitution group in England, they came around 40 years later with all this poppycock, and we eat it up like it's candy, and this has to happen. So, speaking of rude, this is how Roger Hayes speaks of me. 10 people, 10 possible views of value. Sure, but one is resolved between the seller and the buyer. And under this system, the buyer is forced to pay the artificially escalated costs imposed upon the transaction by the fact that ever more of every unit in circulation is dedicated to servicing the escalating sum of falsified debt. And this is why, ultimately, the prices exceed us. This is why the prices have to go up, because industry is the engine of servicing this debt. But anyone with a bit of critical thinking and the courage to do so will invalidate all of this. I'm not hearing the invalidation even from Roger Hayes himself, your favorite topic. Valuing a house is a typical example. In Mike's mathematical mind, as if my mind is only mathematical, he thinks he can design a perfect economy, hence MPE, mathematical perfect economy. Doesn't even have the name right. But he can't. I can't do that. You can't do it either then. We can never perfect economy. If I can't perfect economy, if I can't produce a solution for inflation and deflation, which is a fact of currency is always equal to the remaining value of represented property, which is accomplished merely and only by paying the principal only and retiring the principal at the rate of consumption, which just happens to be in accord with the natural disposition of promissory obligations. No, that's impossible. Why? Because Roger Hayes just says so. How many of you who interviewed Roger Hayes ever challenged any of these things? And while Roger Hayes is denying that we can solve man-made problems by eradicating only the obfuscations that a few men have imposed upon us, while he's denying here that that's even possible, how many of you ever did this critical thinking, which would have challenged this preposterous assertion? He thinks he can design a perfect economy, but he can't, because he does not have a formula for people's perception of value. I don't need to have a formula for your value. That's what mathematically perfected economy accommodates. Whatever you decide to be the price is sustained. And when a promissory obligation has to be issued because immutable representation of entitlement doesn't exist, the necessary relationship between immutable representations of entitlement and the volume of things they may be redeemed in is preserved by maintaining this one-to-one-to-one relationship, which all economists, regardless of whether they're mathematicians or not, accede, in fact, is a critical issue. You wouldn't even hear about inflation and deflation if they weren't perceived to be anomalies with detrimental impact upon we who in fact need an economy which we can't, which we can't even know without mathematic analysis. All we're talking about here, if the buyer and purchaser agree on a price, is units. Who defines their value? We do. Do I have a formula for that? Yeah, I know what the formula is, and so does Roger. We decide whether in our work what we're paying is justified by the work involved in what we're getting. And when our currency is subject to this obfuscation, we can never achieve that object because an additional party is involved, who in fact is even getting from the beginning the lion's share of all the rewards of our production, denying us our rightful share for our production. From the beginning, it's impossible for us to get just reward. But the process only multiplies the falsified debt all the further, taking ever more than the original lion's share, until we can afford neither to produce nor consume any further. I don't have the formula, Roger. You can debate me with that. In Mike's mathematical mind, he thinks he can design a perfect economy, but he can't because he does not have a formula for people's perception of value. Is that what's required? Or, on the contrary, is what required a means of sustaining whatever people perceive to be the value contributed by each person, which is traded in our commerce? Is it sustaining value which is the matter? No, I don't know that John just says, well, I had 3 beers, so I'll give you $50 for a piece of bubble gum. Whatever. Or if John gives a promissory obligation of $50 for a piece of bubble gum, is it important that we sustain the value of those $50 and that we do not impose upon John, whatever fool he may be, the exploitation of our currency, which in fact exploitation Roger Hayes has gone full circle and is advocating. While he pretended to be some kind of intellectual who uncovered these facts himself, misstating all of them, pretending to resolve them with no resolution or even arguments, even credible argument, whatever. And now you're going to have a lawful bank which is also going to impose interest, which won't even have a license to issue money in the laws which exist, which is why people call it awful bank more often than lawful. But he can't because he does not have a formula for people's perception of value. How ridiculous. You can read papers I've written which precedes Roger by, so many decades of wasted time because there are Roger Hayes in the world, and because we don't do our critical thinking. Not here, at least. He does not have a formula for people's perception of value. People have asked me this for 45 years, and I've explained how they apply the formulas they do and what the general guidelines of those formulas are. But you yourselves know you don't have a formula. And you also know, if you do any critical thinking at all, that you're not applying the principles of a formula, which would be necessary to apply if indeed you were to have a mutable representation of entitlement in such volumes as are necessary to sustain the prosperity we remain capable of to this very moment, that Roger Hayes pretends to resolve without math. Roger Hayes pretends to invalidate mathematically perfected economy not only without math, but by pretending, and no more than pretending, to disgrace the only principles that can serve us: immutable representation of entitlement. He denies there's any math to that, but hoping to swerve us to the issue that I don't have a formula for how each and every person determines value. Truth of the matter is, you don't have a formula. And I'm not afraid to say it. And with this very simple schoolboy fact that I don't have a formula, drives a coach and horse through Mike's very flawed concept of perfect economy. Is that so? What coach? What horse? Immutable representation of entitlement. Is there any way to maintain immutable representation of entitlement, but to maintain a circulation which is equal and fully disposed to what it ostensibly represents? What coach? What horse? Why a coach and a horse instead of a fact that would invalidate this proposition? And this very simple schoolboy fact that I don't have a formula for people's perception of money drives a coach and horse through Mike's very flawed concept of a perfect economy. All along, Rogers insisted that his lawful bank had to happen, and then maybe someday we could do mathematically perfected economy. It was an intermediate step. Now he's backpedaled to a fact that that goal of mathematically perfected economy can never be achieved when all it requires is an eradication of banking and an obligatory schedule of payment, which in accord with the natural disposition of promissory obligations necessarily retires principal, which no longer represents value once it's paid and redeemed. So all this is accomplished by is an eradication of banking and an obligatory schedule of payment, retiring principal as we consume of the related property. And this is impossible. And Roger Hayes' lawful bank has to happen first, like One People's Public Trust has to happen first. And all these things are solution. I wish you were critical thinkers. But if you have 5 minutes of time for Roger Hayes, and you haven't invalidated these things yourselves, case closed. I can't do this because I don't have a formula for people's perception of value. But I do. We perceive value in the relative value of our own contributions to production. Invalidate that, any of you. And tell me you don't recognize that you're denied that when banking obfuscates our currency, dedicating ever more of every unit of currency instead of representation of immutable entitlement, dedicating it instead to the artificial escalation of falsified debt until we suffer terminal failure by a fact that too much of every unit is dedicated to servicing this falsified sum of debt as opposed to sustaining the industry and commerce which are obliged to do so. Those are the very facts that Roger Hayes pretended to advocate himself. Now he denies them, and he denies there's a solution for them. And if it were a fact that there were no solution, what could he be arguing for or offering you then? And this very simple schoolboy fact drives a coach and horse through Mike's very flawed concept of a perfect economy. What flaw did he actually raise? You know, people who speak like this, it's obvious from the context and structure of the way that they communicate that all they're trying to do is to blur the facts by making assertions without any fact whatsoever. Cite a fact in all these few words. And as I said, he goes on, anybody who had the courage to think for themselves would have worked it out. Is that so? How so? Particularly if you deny math even applies. He goes on to say, in his vainglorious manner, the lawful bank will succeed where MPE fails. How did he demonstrate that MPE fails on any count? Where MPE fails, lawful bank will succeed because it is based on the reality of people and not numbers. Wow. You mean to tell me your formulas for determining value don't determine numbers? There's some other measure? What a hypocrite. How phony can anyone be? The lawful bank will succeed where MPE fails because it is based on the reality of people and not numbers. Since when does MPE not account for the both? The numbers the people decide in are sustained, and are sustained only by a perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship between the things they decided the numbers represent. Period. There is one math to that representation. There is one solution, and that is a perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship between remaining circulation, remaining value of represented property, in which the circulation then is redeemable in, which it represents and must be redeemable in. And the third thing is between an obligation to pay the remaining value of property off with the remaining circulation, because this obligatory schedule of payment alone precipitates in effect that the remaining value that we haven't consumed is represented by the remaining circulation. Period. Math just can't apply because Roger Hayes says so, or Roger Hayes has never done the thinking or the math that preserves whatever we decide, whatever our formula for that decision is. Roger Hayes has invalidated mathematically perfected economy. He deserves a place amidst the propositions of plurality of purported monetary solutions. Well, you gave him that place. And how many of you did the critical thinking he's suggesting here? Drives a coach through Mike's very flawed concept of a perfect economy Well, what are you offering then? This is unbelievable. I find a debate with Mike is pointless because he just wants to tell the world how he and he alone has discovered the problem. He says in parentheses then, he hasn't. All right. Fair enough. Who identified the obfuscation of the currency before me? You know, people like Roger, who's a pretender of the most preposterous caliber. They want to claim that they thought the same things. And yet, in plagiarism, you find a remarkable thing. Now, many of you think I'm probably stretching the definition of plagiarism, but I'm going to look it up as I speak here to read it to you explicitly from one of my dictionaries. Plagiarism: the practice of taking someone else's work or ideas and passing them off as one's own. The practice of taking someone else's work and passing them off as one's own. Well, inherently, to do that would be to claim that you recognized or others recognized the same thing as well. But if that were a fact, and you were really meaning to establish it as a fact, you would say who these other people were and how they recognized the same fact. Now, it happens that it's my work that preserves the contested quote of Thomas Jefferson: if the American people ever allow the banks to issue their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation. Do you know, Jefferson is one of the people who I most hoped to find had already unraveled the obfuscation. I'm talking, about when I was 16 years old. A mathematician, a skill that Roger Hayes merely claims is irrelevant. I assumed others would have understood this obfuscation was terminal, that is, inherently and inevitably terminal. The process is irreversible so long as we maintain a vital circulation. It's terminal because it inevitably precipitates in a sum of debt we can no longer afford to service. But anyone who recognizes those facts, which were so remarkable as to immediately plagiarize in Thomas Anderson's book, for example, or Jacques Jacquemin's Debt Virus. Jacques Jacquemin wrote me a year before he produced Debt Virus, asking me about my parable of perfect economy, which he assumed and plagiarized from the first page of Debt Virus. He assumed it was faithful history. And Roger, too, has imitated my thought, claiming that others, he doesn't say who, realize the same thing. But in 45 years, and I've had hundreds of people present propositions that someone else at some time recognized those facts which my work introduces, and Roger Hayes just merely denies me without even saying how anyone else even developed those thoughts. And of course it's necessary for him to make that claim only to legitimize his own stealings from that work. But there's so many things which are so preposterous about that assertion. Everywhere you go, Ellen Hodgson Brown, she praised the money advocated in my Parable of Perfect Economy as the most brilliant banking model in history. And some people put me to an article that she'd published in Op-Ed News to challenge her because they knew how preposterous this was, that she was praising my currency, a currency which did not even exist in colonial America. And so I apprised her that the history she was pretending to have researched up from my work didn't even exist. Could she produce a citation? No more than Roger Hayes. In fact, in her arguments, and you can look this up at Op-Ed News, she immediately claimed that she didn't even think interest was the problem. I'd written an article dealing with just strictly interest. Interest is usury, which is a mathematic proof that any amount of interest, which has to be borrowed back into circulation to maintain a vital circulation, precipitates in terminal failure. The lower the rate, the longer it takes. The higher the rate, the faster the same outcome happens. And the concluding words of that article were, "It's the interest, stupid. It's the interest. It's the interest. It's the interest." Today, Ellen Hodgson Brown, who denied interest was the issue, has an article at Global Research, the title of which is "It's the Interest, Stupid." Can Roger Hayes cite Ellen Hodgson Brown, even though he repeats her obfuscation of my work, which now claims that you can't pay the interest because the interest doesn't exist? No one would say that who discovered the facts at hand, because it isn't that you can't pay the interest because it doesn't exist. Many people know for a fact that is even close to true, because particularly in the earliest stages of the life cycle of the obfuscation, it is possible to pay the interest from the money that does exist, even by borrowing it back into circulation. When I was a little boy, a brand new house cost $5,000. And interest rates were low. Do you think it wasn't possible to pay off a house because the interest didn't exist? It's ridiculous. Literally millions and millions and millions of people know it's possible to pay the interest so long as it's possible to pay the interest. But when is that? It's at a certain future point in time when, in order to maintain a vital circulation, and after, for however long we've maintained a vital circulation, by perpetually borrowing interest back into circulation as new debt above a former sum of debt, perpetually sustained by borrowing principal back into circulation as new debt equal to the old, that ultimately we suffer a terminal sum of falsified debt. That isn't because the interest doesn't exist. It's because it does exist. But to keep it into circulation, you have to borrow it back into circulation, because you have to maintain a vital circulation in order to sustain the industry and commerce which are obliged to service the escalating sum of falsified debt until it gets so great we can no longer afford to service it. So can Ellen Hodgson Brown or anyone else, including Roger Hayes, who's claimed you can't pay the interest? You heard him right on TNS. I know you did, because I was listening. And I have it recorded. Roger said you can't pay the interest because it doesn't exist. Does he even understand the problem then, which he's claiming others have understood? And who are the others? He doesn't even name them. Was it Thomas Jefferson? Well, I hope so when I heard those words, first by inflation and then by deflation. But the man who cited those words in a lecture couldn't explain it, and I've never found a word that Jefferson realized that interest was terminal. And I offer you a proposition to fathom in regard to that. What person who did the math to understand the problem could ever resolve the problem, that is, identify the obfuscation of the currency? What person who would do that would ever the rest of their life ever fail to raise the fact that there's an obfuscation by which debt is falsified, which invalidates any claim to interest? You've heard Roger Hayes explain that his bank is going to have to charge some interest. Baloney. There's so much profit in laundering the principal into your unwarranted possession, it's pathetic in the creation of money. And if Roger isn't going to create money on our behalf, according to the only principles that serve us, which can only be understood by their mathematics concurring with our determinations, whatever they may be, then how can Roger Hayes or his purportedly lawful bank ever serve you? So who understood this before? Could you misexplain it when its explicit detail is the set of nuances upon which everything depends? Would you take this implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation and re-express it as an inability to pay interest because interest isn't created, when it's a historic fact that millions and millions and millions and millions of debts have been paid off subject to interest? Never in your life would you compromise the discovery but such an inaccurate portrayal of it. It was Roger Hayes advocating that anyone was so faithful to that discovery as to preserve it even. He doesn't even provide a shred of evidence that he understands yet what that discovery is. I find a debate with Mike is pointless because he just wants to tell the world how he and he alone has discovered the problem. Or was it that discovery of the problem is critical to our potential understanding of a fact of singular solution? Is there any proof of anything, of any of these words of Roger Hayes? Are they not intentional deceptions, all meant to stack up in favor of his purportedly lawful bank? And how many of you even follow his suggestion to subject them to the critical thinking to which they're due? He hasn't discovered the problem, he says, and he refuses to take on board other people's views. Such as what, Roger? Is there a different view which is compatible to the truth? Is it just my way or the highway? Or is there one truth, Roger Hayes? As I understand it, he goes on, Mike has been working on his project for 40 years, and currently spends a great deal of time recording all my videos. No, I haven't, Roger. When I do look at one of your videos, I do save it, and there's only been a few. The first I recall seeing, your audience asked you about money, and they were more prepared to answer their own questions than you were. In fact, replied to them, there's only 20 or 25 people, I think, from what you can tell in the video. You replied that you could take a piece of paper out of your pocket and that could serve equally as money. Which suggests to me, Roger, that you don't understand the problem, because the piece of paper you took out of your pocket isn't subject to exploitation. And you didn't even raise that to your audience. Instead, when you were pressed for a better answer, you simply replied, if you want to understand money, go watch the video, Money is Debt, which of course is produced by another plagiarist who so misunderstood the issues that he thought the consequence of this process, a terminal sum of falsified debt, was the problem in that it's a debt. So stripped the issue of its relevance as to presume that money that's a debt is a problem, when any money that's even redeemable is going to comprise an obligation which equates to a debt. Even a piece of paper which says it's redeemable in gold is a debt to redeem it in gold. No debt, as I've explained since long before Paul Grignon pretended he understood the issue too, and made the video Money is Debt, which Roger Hayes cites as a credible explanation of the problem, which he claims others understood too, which understanding is mutually exclusive, in fact, to mine. These 11th hour pretenders have led you astray at every juncture. And the best that Roger Hayes can do to claim, or to pretend to claim, equal credibility is to discredit my work by claiming that others realized it, when he dare not debate me and make that claim, because I'm so well equipped, because I was in the middle of all these things before any of these 11th hour pretenders stood up to compromise my work, that I know what their business was from the very beginning. All these wonderful people with all these other solutions. If they understood what I had identified, it would be impossible to deviate into any other solution. So the question is, if Roger could be correct that others identified the problem, which has a singular solution, they would have never disputed the solution or deviated from it then. But those are the facts. And if Roger understands it, and if this was a legitimate invalidation of my work, would he or would he not show how their identifications of the same problem precipitate in legitimate different solutions, and particularly in mutually exclusive solutions, which just somehow are called lawful bank and have to precede mathematically perfected economy, or just somehow are called one people's public trust and are issued 4 days, and the work shows it, after formal release of our amendment for mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation, which has been online for many years. One people's public trust, awarding each of you billions of dollars, which Max Igan told you is just a deception. And now, all of a sudden, the deception is a real proposition of solution. You know, personally, I think that a capable public should be incensed by these things. That intelligent, responsible people have no place for treasonous obfuscations of the truth. He alleges I spent a great deal of my of time recording all of his videos. The first one, and I maybe have three, and I would bet that the next two I didn't even listen to the whole thing, just saved it. Why? Because it invalidates any credibility whatsoever of Roger Hayes. I have no idea how many videos he's done. I've only listened to the first 5 minutes of Bill Still's preposterous Money Masters video, which quotes me several times in those first 5 minutes, in which Austrian economists who advocate not only banking but elevated rates of interest pretend to have discovered the problem. When I was a little boy, I refused to go to church. I refused to go to church because the people there were just memorizing things. And I required to resolve them to any facts which might exist. If a God existed, I wanted to understand what God was. If Jesus Christ was the Messiah, I wanted to understand his mission here. Those were ifs. And while I leaned to the agnostic side in my early life, I've observed things that I call the classic questions. This obfuscation of money is one of them. And I do hold that it's impossible to understand the event at the temple of the money changers until we understand this obfuscation of the currency. I likewise hold that if the divine plan was given in the Lord's Prayer, which Jesus ostensibly answered with to the request to teach us how to pray, I hold that mathematically perfected economy particularly given the event at the temple of the money changers, is probably the most critical issue of all times, not just in its monetary effects or its nullification of human rights or its oppression, its unwarranted dispossession, its terminal escalation of unwarranted dispossession, but in the fact that to prevail over an entire world, banking has to corrupt every government to such an extent that our proper cry for monetary justice, for representation, for reparation, can never be heard. Can never be heard. But if we ourselves are the deaf ear which refuses to hear solution, which refuses to defend the truth, which refuses to eradicate, to resist, and to reject, and to disprove every assault upon the truth, so that no offender or prospective offender even could achieve anything amidst a vigilant, responsible, just people. If we're not willing to go that distance, if we're not truly dedicated to it, if that isn't our common objective, then it matters not how many enemies we have in banking or government, or how entrenched they are against us, because we would rout all of this out if we were so inclined as to preserve monetary justice even for our own children. Instead, we're hoping they are going to survive the irrational, insoluble escalation of falsified debt we're simply going to pass on to them, as if math can't apply, or Roger Hayes' arguments, or lack thereof, should prevail. If that's our way, I'm going to find another audience, because if I'm offending you by telling you the truth, by standing by the truth, you're not my people, and neither am I yours. Yes, I argue. I mean to defend the originality of these perceptions, but for the sake of preserving the solution. Yes, Roger Hayes, Max Igan, and Drake, and Benjamin Fulford, and David Wilcock, they'd have it some other way, that some conspiracy theorists just understand all the same things, when they just are content to compromise every nuance so that they can compete with mathematically perfected economy by proposing that they have succeeded already in foreclosing on the banks and setting aside for you a volume of deception that Max Igan himself says doesn't even exist. And they've set aside so much of that deception has never even existed by the account or hand of the deceivers. What does that make us? Mathematically, it makes us worse deceivers and advocates of division than those we're pretending we're going to overcome by exceeding their division. Before I close, I like to thank the many people who encouraged me to take a variety of courses which will likely be the only roads to success. And I'd also like to say that despite the seemingly irreconcilable differences, that good questions are asked. And the reason I like to raise one of those good questions is not only to demonstrate that there are people who are listening, who are evidently estimating the possibility that it is important and that this is the only way to resolve the issues before us. The question is, and I'll leave the person anonymous, though, I think every good question deserves credit. This is one I've answered for many years. I mean, I answered this question exhaustively for the Reagan administration and prescribed the present means of artificially sustaining the lifespan, not to suggest it, but to prove that it had its own terminal limitations as well. So this question repeats that question, but that's a question that requires resolution on the level of the highest executive office of the United States. The same question was asked by advocates of mathematically perfected economy within the first Reagan administration. The question says that, my run last week was okay, that they listened a little more, and they learned a little more. It says, you calculated current low interest rates, and I wonder where it will go from here. In truth, where it will go from here hinges on whether we master these issues and are willing to do the only thing that resolves them. But the answer to that question is mathematical. So contrary to Roger Hayes, contrary to Max Igan's proposition that awarding you a sum of the deception which doesn't even exist might resolve your problems, I'll repeat the answer that I've given many times, of course, not laboring the questioner with the fact that I've answered this probably thousands of times since 1979 when I first explained it to the Reagan campaign. In the first papers I provided them at their request as a product of one telephone call. I'll read my answer. The question again is, you calculated current low interest rates. You understand that economists, the ones who would like us not to think about the math, have always advocated that high interest rates have to be maintained in order to fight price inflation. Whereas my work examples of which I don't find in Thomas Jefferson's work or Samuel Adams, or they were all headed there. The question is, did they get there? And if they got there, how is it that in discovering the problem, you had the math of the problem, which is the math of the solution? Why is it that there was no advocation of mathematically perfected economy before? Why is it, for example, that Ellen Hodgson Brown denied that interest was even the problem? And now she's produced an article using my very words. In its title, it's the interest, stupid. And I suppose you're going to tell me that she wasn't aware of those words. But one thing that plagiarists all have in common is they never cite the work that they're stealing from. Particularly when they have to turn around 180 degrees. I haven't even read that article. It's been posted to me several times in the last couple of months. But even as I haven't read it, what do you want to bet that it still doesn't identify the problem, which would conflict with her original assertions that you can't pay the interest because it doesn't exist? What do you want to bet that it doesn't invalidate the proposition that interest arrests price inflation? Well, I'll tell you how my work did so in a few words. It demonstrates that all that interest does is increase the cost of servicing the escalation of falsified debt, so much that we can't afford the increasing prices that industry is forced to charge to maintain margins of solubility over the increasing sum of falsified debt industry is servicing as a result of this obfuscation. Moreover, in doing the math, my work demonstrates that this is no benefit to us whatsoever, because the higher cost that we would pay in prices to allow industry to service the escalation of debt is instead paid directly to banking, merely because it's increased interest rates to prevent us from being able to afford the increasing costs that industry is forced to charge. So that's the short of it. No benefit whatsoever. You're thinking, oh my God, the cost of peanut butter isn't increasing more than 2% per year, and it was increasing 7%. It's so much better to suffer 15% prime rates than it was the 7% we had before. It's really a benefit to us. We're paying umpteen jillion times more for our houses as a result of it, so that we can't afford to pay the increased prices of peanut butter. What do you want to bet that Ellen Hodgson Brown's article doesn't point that out either? And when she does add it to that material, where do you think it's going to come from? Thomas Jefferson, Roger Hayes, Max Igan, Thomas Anderson, Michael Tellinger. So what's the answer to this question? You calculated current low interest rates. Yes, I did. Provided models to the Reagan administration, which demonstrate the very pattern by which interest rates had to be reduced to sustain the live economy this long. Those models projected we'd reach terminal failure at approximately 2010 AD. We're in the failure. That was a conservative estimate. We actually entered failure before then. And to get that far, those models decreased interest rates and decreased interest rates each time that we entered terminal failure at a given interest rates to give us a little more breathing room for a while longer until the interest rates get to zero or thereabouts, which isn't the street rate, because what I call peripheral banks or intermediate banks have to charge some interest above the prime rate in order to sustain their operations against their costs. You aren't paying zero interest on your house. But that is a possibility, and it's one to contemplate. And are we going to do that without math? And is the math invalid because Roger Hayes says so? If Roger's right, you need not listen on. But this is the math. I'll read my answer. I'll give you your three potential answers in order of likelihood. The first answer, or one, is how it is going to shake out, I think. Actually, it's the only serious candidate as an answer, that is. But the caveats on answers 2 and 3 indicate why number 1 is the only sound bet in plain English. Anything else is a virtual admission the crime is terminal, something I think we should seriously consider, that banking would never want to make so obvious. In other words, if the deceptions are intended, the courses I outline in alternatives 2 and 3 are implausible. So is number 1 implausible, in other words. That is, the present conditions and artificial sustention are implausible in the same way, but not to the same degree. They're a virtual admission the crime is terminal, but number 1 is more implicit or discrete than the more explicitly incriminating extents of potential courses 2 and 3. Just some background information which puts this answer in its proper context. The reason interest rates have dropped to where they are, of course, is that the very artificial, redundant, and irreversible escalation of falsified debt, which interest precipitates in, ultimately forces the rates to come down, as I just explained in how my models operated. Otherwise, further escalation of a terminal sum of debt under the present rates, whatever they are, makes it impossible for the victims to continue to service and to survive the escalation for however long that may remain possible under the subsequent rate and potential further reductions. So, is this math not relevant to how long you can survive the obfuscation? Is math irrelevant to understanding these problems? Can we answer this question without its math? No, Roger Hayes, we cannot. This consequence, of course, is a ramification of adhering to the pretended constructs or requisites of the system. Of course, if bankers were really lending legitimate representations of their wealth into existence, they could never risk lending us more than conditions or approaching inevitable failure have already proven to exceed our capacity to service existing debt. In other words, what I'm saying there is, given that we've exceeded the debt that we can service, if banking was lending legitimate representations of their wealth or entitlement into a circulation from which we could never pay it because we can't survive the present escalation of debt, then banking would never make this risk, the very risk that's transpiring at all moments underneath your very noses right now. Thus, a terminal sum of falsified debt at any interest rate, street rate that is, predicates either A, an immediate and effective reduction of interest rates, in other words, to extend the lifespan of taking, or B, terminal conditions which unfold their full force, which of course we're not seeing, so that's not what's happening. C, if the banking system is either unwilling or unable to reduce further, in other words, those terminal conditions only unfold their full force if banking is unwilling or unable to reduce rates further. Or D, if a reduction of rates can only temporarily sustain enough of the economy against the terminal conditions. So those are the extents that reduction or failure to reduce impose conditions upon us which we can survive to whatever extents. There is a math to all this, and it's how much you can pay the bank against this escalation of falsified debt. No math? It's not necessary to resolve it. I suppose if you're advocating interest, you might advocate that math can't resolve any of this, and you might pretend that that's because a whole other issue disproves the relevance of math to this. We don't do that in anything that human beings succeed in. We don't pretend that the only means to solution is irrelevant because we pretend that we can't resolve something else, which in fact we do resolve. We do determine what prices are. We do agree to that, and we do need to sustain that. And the only way that we do is by mathematically perfected economy in this one-to-one-to-one relationship. A thing which even economists aspire is to resolve in the fact that they raise that inflation and deflation are problems. They never mention maldisposition because they're unwarranted advocates of interest or the obfuscation, which Roger doesn't want to address, of course, because he's advocating it too. His bank's going to impose interest on you, some solution. And of course, you need to invalidate the math that invalidates your solution. But of course, Roger doesn't address the math. He attempts to translate it to some situation that isn't even an issue. Whatever we decide for our prices is between us in a truly free economy. What you're interested in money, is sustaining the contractual obligations which precipitate from the fact that, well, if money doesn't exist to represent entitlement, then it has to be created. And thus it has to be created as a promissory obligation, and thus as that entitlement only exists until it's fulfilled, the lifespan of a promissory obligation ceases upon fulfillment. And therefore money has to be retired. And if it's to be an immutable representation of entitlement, the only of which fact sustains original obligations and our need for immutable representation of entitlement, then the only further thing to resolve is that it has to be paid and retired from circulation as we consume of the related property. And guess what? All those things are likewise just, because they're the objects that we set up when we create this thing that we have to set up, which is a promissory obligation. And there you have it. Mathematically perfected economy again. Why it has to exist, why it's the only solution. And yet we can't apply the math to what we're paying in principal and interest from a circulation, when Roger Hayes himself tells you you can't pay the interest because it doesn't exist, and he pretends that equates to my discovery. Anyway, I go on to explain here that thus a terminal sum of falsified debt at any interest rate predicates either A, an immediate and effective reduction of interest rates, or B, terminal conditions which unfold their full force, C, if the banking system is either unwilling or unable to reduce rates further, or D, if a reduction of rates can only temporarily sustain enough of the purported economy against the terminal conditions. The latter, D, will transpire inevitably if any failure to relieve and sustain marginalized sectors precipitates to further marginalized sectors. In other words, when one sector begins to fail, it jeopardizes the others which depend upon it. If you are owed money and you're surviving, you have enough clients to barely survive, and one of your clients can no longer pay you, that can push you over the edge. In other words, ultimately, even if rates are reduced to zero at the central bank, the need for a profit margin to sustain peripheral banks, which interface with the private sector, precipitates in positive rates, which continue to multiply the falsified sum of debt. So that's under answer 1. So we still have terminal failure, even when the central bank rates go to zero, and the street rates, of course, are positive because the intermediate creditor has to have a cut, which forces the rates above zero because that's how they take their cut. The minimal amount of further relief provided by reducing to near zero rates by the central bank, therefore, provides negligible relief in the peripheral bank rates, and the system begins to go down like a house of cards then when collapsing sectors bring down adjacent dependent sectors. So we're in the midst of these very facts and events in which a further decline, even to little further damage in any given area, is sufficient to bring the whole thing down, like the proverbial house of cards. With prime rates at or near zero, then, ultimate street rates will ultimately precipitate in terminal failure when the weight of a terminal sum of debt ultimately imposes its consequences, despite any artificial means of sustaining the system by effectively pouring money into circulation, as we see with federal overspending, without which we would not have a vital circulation, or what circulation we do have, and of course with the failure, the full weight of the failure would immediately be upon us if no one had any money at all. And this transpires when marginalized sectors begin to break over compromising dependent sectors. This is inevitable because some of the money they pour into circulation doesn't reach remote sectors. The money isn't distributed everywhere. In fact, the influx has few real potential recipients. Something very important to think about. Because artificial sustention is already indispensable at near zero rates, we are already suffering a terminal sum of falsified debt, in which conditions the actual related degree of bankruptcy, foreclosure, and so forth would only be known or experienced to their actual and inevitable extents if we who are incurring the present accumulation of federal debt were servicing that debt to the degree it should impose upon we who tolerate its imposition upon us. Because our capacity to service debt is exceeded by a perpetually escalating sum of already terminal debt, the circulation is perpetually restored only by federal overspending. Without it, we would fail. Of course, we should presume that owing to the intentions of the scheme, the banks aren't going to give us money like they do the federal government, even as they could. Yes, they could. Because effectively they'd be pouring that money too right into the pockets of bankers. I'll cover these possibilities as alternatives 2 and 3. So number 1, in summary then, is so the present conditions are the first possibility to mention, that we are sustained, however temporarily, in the present state by the banking system effectively giving away money, but only through federal overspending, which free money, unserviced additional debt, is then paid right back out of circulation into the pockets of the bankers, with no real possibility for that cycle to be broken by our earning from the banks what we need to earn if it were possible to end or even to arrest or reverse the cycle of further escalation, that is. You can't reverse the cycle because maintaining a minimal terminal circulation requires further borrowing, which perpetually increases an already terminal sum of falsified debt, all the further beyond an already terminal state. There you have the world predicament, which I'm sure Roger regularly cites by saying money doesn't exist, or so long as we succeed in sustaining the state artificially, no better than the present conditions will likely prevail. And furthermore, as the present federal overspending is not preventing individuals, families, larger units, businesses, trades, industries, etc., from falling into failure, thus we have the very real possibility that some escalation of the effects of the failure precipitate in the gross and ultimately rapid failure of the whole system, with so much being marginalized already. Falling a wee bit further behind may end the whole game. So this is the most likely scenario as we understand from evaluating the following. I give the second and third possibilities. Number 2, the central banking system can also reduce its rates to 0 or marginally negative, with this still precipitating in a positive street rate, which is still terminal because it multiplies debt in proportion to the circulation still. And the number 3 is, and furthermore, They can reduce their rates. This is possible. Remember, they're profiting to the degree that they launder principal into their unwarranted possession. Interest isn't even necessary to make an incredible profit equal to all the principal of all the things which are ever financed, purportedly financed by this obfuscation of our currency. Number 3 is, and furthermore, they can reduce their rates to such sufficiently negative rates that the street rate is negative as well, where the peripheral banks could then succeed in maintaining the additional margins they require to cover costs, and thus the central banking system would effectively be paying us to borrow further money into circulation, even as there is little likelihood they would do so to extents which would introduce the phenomenal additional sums we would need to service this additional debt as well, which costs would otherwise prevent any actual degree of recovery. So I explain these two further propositions. The problem with potential alternatives 2 and 3 is they break the pattern or ostensible requisites of banking so severely that we should intuit then that banking or interest indeed have produced the terminal effects, because both processes so much as concede this as a fact. I explained this to the Reagan administration in 1979, in 1983, and 1984. All the while still, the extremes and requisites of Alternative 3 illustrate how much banking would have to concede just to have a real hope of a minor extent of real relief. And even this would come at the cost of an experiment which proves itself that the terminal nature of banking. In which experiment, then, we would prove all the principles of MPE are indeed indispensable. For these reasons, I don't believe the concessions of alternatives 2 or 3 are plausible to those who run the system, because alternative 1, the present conditions and processes, will itself inevitably fail, even more so than alternatives 2 and 3. Therefore, our only real alternative, that is, the only truly credible alternative of the people, is mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation, which of course is why I penned the damn paper for all this while. Thanks again for listening. I'm Mike Montagne, and we are all related.